Good morning, church. Good morning. Welcome back, Kay and Charlene, from your sojourns. They modeled walking with God as well, we hope. Let's begin our time together with a moment of silence for all those lives that have been cut short in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Israel, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, in Yemen. Let us be in silence. O God, when words fail us, hear our prayer. In your name we pray. Amen. Must the sword devour us forever? There have been 10 months of genocide in Gaza, more settler violence than ever in the West Bank against Palestinians. There are repeated bombings in Lebanon, in northern Israel, and as I mentioned, in countries all across the Middle East. There were targeted assassinations in the last couple of weeks in Tehran and in Beirut. Must the sword keep devouring us forever? So I picked a light topic for this morning. But we need to wrestle with that. Yet, there's also been massive global protests. Student encampments, not so far away. Some of us were at those encampments. Dock workers refusing to ship weapons to Israel. Boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. International Court of Justice rulings. Turkey, Colombia, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, one country after another, Ireland, have all taken actions to cut off the supply of arms to Israel that continue this genocide against the people of Palestine. And still, nothing has stopped the US and Israeli governments from devouring more and more lives. Massive civil disobedience, rabbis for ceasefire now, Jewish voice for peace, B'Tselem, rabbis for human rights and groups in Israel, along with all the Palestinian human rights groups, have not been able to stop it. Too many political leaders and church leaders still remain silent and make tepid statements calling for a ceasefire at the same time as they absolutely condemn Hamas and absolutely defend the right of Israel to self-defense. We need to re-examine that notion of self-defense. Never does a political leader in the United States or Israel, or for that matter, much of the so-called civilized world, talk about the right of self-defense for Palestinians when facing massive, brutal violence. Well, this week, some of you were at Riverside Church, we're at the Church Center for the UN. We had the Reverend Munter Isaac, an amazing, powerful Palestinian Christian preacher and pastor who was here on a 2-week tour in 8 or more cities across the country. He just finished in Atlanta yesterday, but he was here for several days. I felt like we could just, have a little sharing, little testimonies from those who were there, and I could sit down and that would really be the sermon for this morning. It was at Riverside. His title was Silence is Complicity. In the same place that Martin Luther King delivered his speech on Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. How ironic it is for Palestinians who often have no time to be buried by their families, but are buried under the rubble, that the only silence we offer them is a moment for the many, the thousands and tens of thousands of unnamed victims whose lives have been cut short. But, so my job could be just to share what Munther offered. And I hope to do a little bit of that. And I want to say the most critical thing is that we listen. We listen over and over again to Palestinian voices in the face of this genocide. Let Palestinians speak for themselves. That's an important lesson we've learned from some of the liberation theology little webinars that we've done as a congregation about Black theology, Latin American liberation theology, and we have more to come. So, but stay tuned for Love in Action for that. I won't. We need also to hear Palestinian voices. Munther challenged us that the actions in the streets and on campuses in September are far more important than any actions in November in the United States if we're going to stop this genocide. Yet this listening is only a first step. It is the swords sold and provided by the United States with our tax dollars and with our elected officials' blessings that keep devouring so many Palestinian lives, men, women, and children. Must our swords keep devouring Palestinians forever? So I think you get the sense of the title here. It actually is a quote. It comes from a former Israeli general, General Abner. Now, Abner was a general way back when, and you can find it in 2 Samuel, the 2nd chapter. Abner was Saul's general, who, sort of was in charge when things were not going so well with the Philistines, and they had to call on a boy, David, to kind of come in. And he's in conflict with Joab, the general for David. So two generals are pursuing each other. And Abner and his men, and it was men, made it to a hill. They're surrounded by General Joab, and it does not look good. And at that point, Abner calls out, "Must the sword devour us forever? Will it not only lead to bitterness? Aren't we brothers, siblings to one another?" And something miraculous happened. A general whose power and prestige in the world was made by killing others or threatening to kill others listened. Joab said, "Oh my God, if you had not spoken up, we just would have kept on killing you all." And Abner had just killed Joab's brother, so there was a lot of antagonism going on here. And he blew the trumpet and there was a ceasefire. So when we talk about a ceasefire, we need to be, how do we reach the generals as well as others to say, wait, could we listen to Abner's cry and Joab's response? Now, I don't want to be all romantic about the Bible. One chapter later, Joab finds a way to get revenge and kills Abner in an alley in duplicitous ways. So it didn't last. So when we call Christians for a ceasefire now, Jews, rabbis for a ceasefire now, that's only for now. That's a first step. We need to understand that a ceasefire is necessary, but by no means sufficient for justice to be established and peace to be lasting. Now, I came to this text more recently about Abner because Abner's tomb is in Hebron, in Palestine. It's right at the bottom of the stairs that lead up to the Ibrahimi Mosque and to the synagogue. It's right next to a Palestinian checkpoint that blocks all the Palestinians that want to worship there have to go through. And it was not so far from Abner's tomb that 30 years ago in February of 1994, a medical doctor from Brooklyn put on his military uniform, went into the mosque and killed 29 worshipers and wounded over 100 more while they were praying. That was Baruch Goldstein, who is now celebrated by members of the Israeli cabinet as a hero. Settlers look to him and go to his tomb near Hebron to pay homage to a man who went from the duty to save lives as a doctor to the hatred and violence of taking lives. That was less than 6 months after the so-called Oslo Accords, where there was a handshake on the White House lawn in September of '93. People may remember that. The hopes were, we all had great hopes for peace, and yet there were those who did not want to put away the sword, did not want to stop the devouring of lives and land. Israeli leaders walked past Abner's tomb regularly to attend worship at the synagogue and to assert Jewish supremacy over the land. But they refused to listen to Abner's cry. Must the sword devour us forever? Aren't we siblings? Dozens of Palestinian shops on Shahada Street and in the old city of Hebron have been welded shut by the Israeli military to protect illegal settlers who are seizing more and more Palestinian land. And on that, the graffiti all over Hebron, if folks have been there, is the Hebrew word for revenge. Revenge. That brings us to today's lesson. I looked at Andrea and others invited me to preach like way back in June. So I was like, I know we try and follow the lectionary. Let's go to the lectionary. Let's see what it is. It's all about David dies, and then we go on to Solomon and the wisdom. And I was like, well, wait, like what's before that? So I looked, I was like, oh, the last words of David. Oh, and when I read them, I was like, oh, I can see why the lectionary guys decided not to include this. It's a rough, like, whoa, what happened to like little David play on your harp and like, David, the underdog taking on Goliath, like, David kind of messing with Saul's mind but refusing to kill him? Like, what happened to that guy? He's like, now, Solomon, listen, I'm gonna die, I'm out of here, I'm in hospice right now. Take out these enemies for me, and I got a list for you. Like, don't let their gray beard go down without blood. So we won't go more further in that, but I just want to say, in the midst of genocide, we need to listen to those words and wrestle with them. That command of violent vengeance against David, now let me just say, Joab was like the fixer for King David. David had a problem, and Joab would fix it. He had a problem like his son was rebelling, Absalom. He couldn't strike down his son. He couldn't confront his son, who was nevertheless confronting him. Joab's like, I got this one. I'll take him out. And he's upset, but Joab did that a number of times. We don't have time to go into like all of those stories. Andrea already did fast forward. We heard from Ekema last week about Nathan and confronting King David. But there's something about David that does stick with us, though not in this story, is when he's confronted by Nathan, when he's confronted by prophets. Unlike way too many political and religious leaders today, he's like, wow, I was wrong. I sinned. I need to redirect my course. Now, he was then pretty off to like figuring out a weaselly way to redirect the course so that kind of he did okay in that. But can I just say parenthetically, Nathan saying, you are the man, was a little bit like the International Criminal Court issuing indictments. They didn't have an International Criminal Court back then, but Nathan was kind of naming the folks who are war criminals. So let me just say, today, the actions of Solomon, the wisdom of, let's wrestle with, let's not give Solomon a break either here. I'm just giving pretty hard on all these guys. Solomon's wisdom, it's like, oh, isn't this lovely? You know, it's like repeatedly, Aurora read, like, use your wisdom, be wise, Solomon. In the next chapter, he kills his brother Adonijah. He kills General Joab, and he kills Shimei, the folks that his father named. The cycle of revenge and violence continues to solidify his power as king. So always be wary when political leaders say that we have to make security and self-defense first. It ends in the death of others. After 9/11, security was the top priority in the United States, and how many people died over the next few decades and continue to die because of US claims of security and self-defense. Today, the sword keeps devouring mosques, churches, hospitals, schools, homes. There is no sanctuary. And let me say, Solomon killed Adonijah and Joab in the sanctuary. Like, there were no safe places. Just as in Gaza today, there are no safe places. Now, let me just offer a word of caution. Lest you think I'm going too literal here with these words and like what, you know, like equating like ancient Israel kings and current Israeli government or US government. We need to listen for the enduring power of these biblical stories that keep speaking truth to us in our current situation of brokenness, even when we may not want to listen. It's too late now. I mean, I think you saw in this sort of invitation to today's service that there might just be a pastoral call. It's too late for David for a pastoral call, but do you suppose we could make a pastoral call on our leaders? I mean, some of them are going to be gathering all together in Chicago next week. Tomorrow. What might the words from 1 Peter, the writer of 1 Peter, and I say the writer because I think it's very possible it was a woman that wrote Peter, displaced, it's written to the exiles, to the refugees, the displaced. And it's words that I use every time I go through Israeli security or security in other countries. When I go through checkpoints in Hebron or checkpoints in Bethlehem, I remember these words from 1 Peter. Do not fear what they fear. And do not be intimidated. But always remember the hope that is in your heart, which is Jesus. Now, what kind of words are those in the face of genocide? And yet, can we listen to our Palestinian sisters and brothers when a building has been leveled, a whole family has been lost, and one of the survivors who's trying to get folks out of the rubble says, Allah Akbar. God is greater. God is greater than this genocide. I don't know how they say that. I've been busy asking God, where are you? And I think God may be asking me and asking us, where are you? But can we join at least in that call of Allah Akbar, that God is greater, instead of this being demeaned in Western media as a terrorist call to violence? It's an affirmation of God, and that's one of the things that David lost over his life. At the end of his life, he was more concerned about the power of political mechanisms and economic mechanisms of the kingdom than he was about fearing God and being loyal to God. He was taking on giants, literally, because God was with him. But he lost that. So 1 Peter invites us to challenge the powerful. Now, we got to challenge them with gentleness and respectfulness. That's a tough, in practice is how we get not only to Carnegie Hall, but also to the admonitions of 1 Peter. And we need to ask, like, how many folks have heard, like, where's the Palestinian Nelson Mandela? Where's the Palestinian Martin Luther King? They're dead. They were killed by targeted assassinations and strikes. There was a nonviolent movement in 2018 on the anniversary of the Nakba of refugees in Gaza, where 80% of the population are refugees and their descendants, to march peacefully to the border and say, we want to visit Jerusalem. We want to express our right to return. And they were repeatedly shot and killed. Palestinians in the First Intifada in the West Bank refused to pay taxes. They boycotted. They divested. They were nonviolent. And the policy of Rabin, who is the peacemaker of Oslo, was a policy of broken bones. The soldiers would grab Palestinian youth and break their legs and break their arms. So if we ask, where is the Palestinian Mandela and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, might we also ask, where is the Jewish Israeli Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Mandela? There's a few. We can find them in B'Tselem, the human rights organization, in Yesh Din, in the refuseniks, the folks that have refused to serve in the military. There's a few, but not enough. When will a US leader say no to this genocide? Say no to Jewish supremacy or white supremacy or any kind of supremacy? First Peter reminds us that our loyalty is not to the powerful, but to God and to Jesus, who lives in our hearts, if we can just open our hearts to Jesus' guidance. So maybe a family protest that's called for Chicago right now to stop the sword from devouring, to stop the making and exporting of swords. Maybe that family protest, they may estimate 30, 40,000 or more people gathering tomorrow to call for an arms embargo, to an end to swords. Maybe that's exactly the kind of blessing that leaders gathered in Chicago, leaders in Washington, D.C., leaders in the Knesset need to hear over and over and again. Maybe the pitching of tents that happened not so far away at City College and Columbia University, a gentle yet persistent protest, like pitching a tent, really? Like, that's so problematic? Is met with tear gas and threats, reprisals, and doxing. The writer of 1 Peter reminds us, even if you suffer, it's better to suffer for doing what's right. That's what Munter may be calling for in terms of what's happening in September as students re-enroll. But who else shows up? Will we be there as a church to offer solidarity and support? So there's three lessons. I've lifted up this loyalty. Who are we serving? Is it God, or is it money and power and military might? We need to reject this notion of self-defense that is based on military might and preemptive strikes. Second, don't fear what they fear. There's some delightful Palestinian family, the Nassar family, in the Tent of Nations. I think many of you may have heard of the Tent of Nations, some of you may have visited it. Daoud Nassar, Daoud is Arabic for David, and Amal Nassar, his sister, and Amal is Arabic for hope. They have a farm just south of Bethlehem, and there's a sign on a rock in front of it that says, "We refuse to be enemies. Do whatever you want, but we're going to keep farming the land, and we are going to treat you as neighbors and refuse to be enemies." Now, Ekim, I know you had a list of enemies before, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have the list, but could we refuse to be enemies? What would that be like for the US government, for us as a society to say, we don't have any enemies, there's no conflict, but there's some violence and swords that need to stop. So don't fear what they fear. Third and finally, I love this part, don't be intimidated. Like this notion that nonviolence is somehow passive. Like, oh wow, isn't it terrible, the things that are going on? Sorry, I got one digression here. Folks may remember the Reverend Dr. Sam Proctor, who longtime senior pastor at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And one time I heard him preaching at Riverside Church, and he said, I was riding the subway one day, and it was very crowded, and there was a very pregnant woman who got on the subway, like she was due that day, or maybe last week. And he said, not a single person got up to offer her a seat. He said, I just sat there in amazement. So in the admonition of St. Sam Proctor, can we just stand up? Like, let's not just stay sitting in amazement or sitting in despair. Don't be intimidated. It means we can stand up. And if we get knocked down, we stand up again. So let's keep standing. Let's keep walking with our Palestinian sisters and brothers. Now, folks who heard Murther, one of the first times I met him, it was at a Christ at the Checkpoint conference. It was the second time they'd done it. They did it the first time in 2010. This was now 2012, and suddenly it was getting a lot of attraction. A lot of big names were coming, Christian Zionists, Messianic Jews. It was a wild cacophony of people that were showing up in Bethlehem for this thing, and the Israeli authorities noticed. So they said, who's the planner of this thing? Well, Munther was the dean at the Bible school and Bible college, and he was called in. So he's meeting with the Israeli authorities, I forget which ministry, and they were like, you can't have Christ and the Checkpoint in the same title. And he's like, well, it's gone out to tens of thousands of people around the world already. I don't think we can undo that. It's like, no, you just can't do that. He said, well, would you like me to put a disclaimer on that the Israeli government does not like the title of our conference? I could put that up if you want on the web. No, you have to take it down. He said, no. And besides, we don't like this image of like the steeple and the cross is like right next to the wall. And he said, well, are you going to take down the wall? That would solve the problem. And they're like, no, you have to change the graphic. And he refused. And so this went on back and forth. You can see this was not getting very productive conversation. And finally, in exasperation, the Israeli authorities said, well, we'll have people there watching. And Munther looked back at them and said, sir, we're live streaming. You can watch it right here from your desk, and we hope you will. That's not being intimidated. So the work of violence and the work of the sword is so swift and so devastating. We can get confused when our work for justice seems so slow. It's like planting a tree. It needs watering. It needs pruning. It may be years before that tree bears fruit. But planting that tree in the midst of trees being demolished, in the midst of this violence and genocide, is the very hope that shakes empires. So, let's bless the powerful, our political leaders, our church leaders, and any government leaders around the world with a pastoral call, with some non-intimidated, loving acts of boycott and divestment and sanctions. After all, Jesus commanded us to put away the sword. That's, I'm pretty sure, Kate, check with me, that's Greek for an arms embargo. Just stop it. So, as we got ready to go forth today, could we just declare that it's time for the military-industrial complex to enter a hospice program? We could all be pastoral visits, pastoral calls on the military-industrial complex as it's passing away, so that would be a genuine blessing for Palestinians, Israelis, and for us all. Let the people say, Amen. Amen.